Hi, Ryan Spence, the curator of Battleship, New Jersey Museum at Board. And today we've got another video that's tangentially related to battle carriers. Hooray! Just a reminder, I hate the concept of battle carriers. Never thought they work very well. But within the last couple of months, we found that the museum had eventually the only existing set of blueprints of a battle carrier conversion for the Idle class battleships in the late 70s, early 80s time period. And that set us off down a research rabbit hole. But even though I hate the concept of battle carriers, I've been studying Idle class battleships for some 30 years now, so finding new stuff, finding original primary documents that nobody else has seen before is super exciting, even if I don't like the idea. And so I think continuing to research it, and some of you guys still tune in to watch it for some unknown reason. Anyway, in one of the previous videos that we brought up, one of my good friends, Noah, at the Tri-State Warplanes Museum in Ohio, sent me an article with some more information in it. Some of the blueprints that we found had depictions of aircraft in it. Some of the aircraft were things like carriers that are instantly recognized. They're 70s, 80s era aircraft, very common. But a lot of the other aircraft that were like taped on to the runway and the hangar to show how many could fit looked really, really weird. Stuff that I've never seen. I know water boats very good. I know no ground boats or air boats very good. So Noah, who is an expert on aircraft, sent me this article that had some really interesting information that I'd never seen before. And this will be familiar maybe to some of you, but I'm hoping a lot of you will be just excited to find this out as a payout. Long story short, there was a push in the U.S. Navy during the late Cold War to convert all aircraft VTOL. So VTOL is vertical takeoff and landing. STOL is short takeoff and landings. Those two are commonly used together. You'll usually see it written out as V /S TBL, something like that, as the acronym for these types of very specialized aircraft. And that was primarily the types of aircraft that were designed to be operating by the Iowa battle carrier version and a number of other smaller carrier designs that the Navy had in the 70s and 80s. So, to backtrack a little bit to what was covered in the past, Admiral Sunwald came up with this high-low concept where we're going to have these high-end assets, like the super carriers, and then we should also have a low-end asset. Because you see this a lot with ships like guided destroyers, but then really cheap, mass-producible frigates. And this concept isn't new. Sunwald was a huge proponent of it, especially in the Cold War, beginning to build up numbers, but it exists all the way back to World War II and arguably earlier than that. It's not uncommon to see ideas where you're going to have these high-end prestige items and much lower-end items that are doing the same job but cheaper and to a limited capacity. And so the Navy is looking at making smaller aircraft carriers, because Congress isn't funding as many super carriers as they want. So, and these smaller carriers may be much like the escort carriers of World War II for the type of war that they're expecting to fight against the Soviet Union in the late war. The Soviet Union has a large and powerful Air Force, large and powerful Navy, particularly their submarine assets, which exceed the United States'. And so we were expecting, in a Cold War scenario, or a Cold War going hot scenario, I should say, that our main job is going to be to convoy assets from the United States to Europe, much like we had to do during World War II. That the Soviet submarines were going to do basically the same thing the German U-boats were doing. And so from there, it's not much of a mental leap to determine that we need a lot of low-end assets, like frigates and escort carriers. They weren't called escort carriers in these designs, but smaller ships like that. You don't want to expend super carriers in this role. And so that's part of the genesis of the idea for making Iowa-class battleships partial aircraft carriers.
Interestingly, one of the largest proponents of this concept was an opponent of the battle carrier concept for the battleships. It's the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral James. The Soviet Union has a large and powerful Air Force, large and powerful Navy, particularly their submarine assets, which exceed the United States'. And so we were expecting, in a Cold War scenario, or a Cold War going hot scenario, I should say, that our main job was going to be to convoy assets from the United States to Europe, much like we had to do during World War II. That the Soviet submarines were going to do basically the same thing the German U-boats were doing. And so from there, it's not much of a mental leap to determine that we need a lot of low-end assets, like frigates and escort carriers. They weren't called escort carriers in these designs, but smaller ships like that. You don't want to expend super carriers in this role. And so that's part of the genesis of the idea for making Iowa-class battleships partial aircraft carriers. But interestingly, one of the largest proponents of this concept was an opponent of the battle carrier concept for the battleships. It's the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral James Holloway. He was Chief of Naval Operations in the late 70s. So right around when they were talking about reactivating the Iowas, then it began that conversation that ultimately ends in the Iowas being reactivated after Holloway retires, after Carter is replaced by Reagan. So it is at the beginning of this process, but these folks have to be removed before the folks who want the Iowa-class battleships to actually put in place. So right around this time, the Cold War is at its highest. We also get the Harrier coming out, the British design, the Harrier, which is the first Western vertical takeoff and landing capable aircraft. And while it's really cool aircraft, really captures the public imagination during this time frame, it has some severe limitations. But if you look at the design history of the Harrier, you can see that as it's designed, which goes all the way back to basically the end of World War II, the beginning of jet aircraft, that designs leading towards this begin, you can see that each successive design gets way more capable. So there was this thought that once the Harrier rolls out into mass production, and the Soviet bloc had their own equivalent, the Soviet Union had their own equivalent, the Yak-38 Forger, which was their primary fighter bomber type aircraft from the Kiev class of aviation cruisers, they would call them, but they're really close to the idea of the CVB or the escort carrier type of idea that the United States is looking at during the same time here. And then, of course, you see the Harriers being deployed on the British aircraft carriers of this time period, and also on the American amphibious assault ships of this time period, which sort of fill a lot of the same niche as the escort carrier. And so there was this thought that the vertical takeoff and landing capability was going to continue to evolve exponentially, and that in a very short period of time, maybe by the middle to late 90s, if the Cold War continues and money keeps being pumped into these developments, that the entire United States Navy could go to vertical takeoff and landing, which would revolutionize naval warfare, because it means that you don't need a full fleet carrier to launch these. You can have smaller carriers, you can have them launched off of battleships, you could have them launched off of cruisers and destroyers that have hangars that would normally carry helicopters. Now, when I say all aircraft, I don't just mean airplanes. I mean aircraft includes helicopters as well. They were looking at replacing every aviation asset in the U.S. Navy with these types of aircraft at a certain point. So they broke these types into 3 different versions. And these versions are listed as types A, B, and C. And keep in mind that we're trying to fill every role that naval aviation is fulfilling at this point, are types A, B, and C. And the first type, type A, is an airplane that would replace nearly a dozen different types of subsonic aircraft, which have assigned missions from anti-submarine warfare, advanced early warning, carrier on board delivery, search and rescue, and marine assault. So these types of aircraft would be taking over the roles of the 80s era aircraft like the S-3 Viking that's being used for anti-submarine, like the Harrier, which is being used for marine assault, like AWACS aircraft and COD aircraft like the Hawkeye and the Greyhound, which are the same airframe, just different sensors and things all that. So, and we do see some of these types of aircraft on the blueprint designs. They're starting with the subsonic support type aircraft here because they're still thinking of this evolutionarily, where we've got the Harrier that's got certain capabilities. It's extremely limited compared to traditional takeoff and landing. It can't carry as much either fuel for range and endurance or armament for being able to fulfill its assigned mission. So obviously subsonic burns a lot less fuel. It's going to be easier to work through a couple iterations of those Type A aircraft, start to rotate out those types of aircraft that are in the fleet, some of which we still use today because they haven't been replaced, like the Hawkeye, Greyhound type aircraft. Others, like the Viking, have had their role in anti-submarine taken over by vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, just not airplanes. It's been fully subsumed by the helicopters, which were also doing that job simultaneously. So once you've got Type A aircraft worked out, then you can go to Type B aircraft, which would replace about a half a dozen types of both sub and supersonic aircraft with assigned missions of air-to-air combat and air-to-surface combat and reconnaissance. So these are things like the F-18, which is just coming online, the F-14 Tomcat, which is your primary air-to-air aircraft, your Corsairs and your Crusaders, your sort of bomber-type aircraft. Those are all being replaced in this second phase. So your aircraft that have really high payloads or that go really fast, or like the Tomcat does both. And again, they're looking at continuing the development through the Harrier and through what other companies had going on. Just about every company was working on various VTOL types of aircraft during this time period. Even though to this day, I think we've only got 3 VTOL aircraft that have ever gone into like full production. The Flogger and its variants, the Harrier and its variants, and now the F-35 Lightning, which is the only next generation vertical takeoff and landing aircraft that's been developed so far.
So finally, once they've worked through all this, probably by the early 2000s, Admiral Holloway speculated, then they would move on to Type C aircraft, which is things more like your helicopters, your rotary wing aircraft, that really they're already taking off straight up and down. But if you have developed vertical takeoff and landing jets to such a high degree, then at this point you can make those helicopters, or the successors to these helicopters, jet powered, so they're going to move much faster, they'll have heavier carrying weight, and so they'll be more capable like that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, Holloway's time as CNO is up. He had originally proposed this in a Naval Institute Proceedings magazine. It sparked enough debate that this report was written where they go in and look at, hey, is it actually feasible? And the answer of this report, we linked it in the description below if you'd like to read it and find out more about this interesting time period. But the answer seems to be, it's theoretically feasible, but we've got no idea about a time frame because we literally have one aircraft to base this off of, the AV-8A Harrier, and projections for what the AV-8B Harrier can do. So then looking at the transition from A to B means this much extra payload, this much extra range. That lets us extrapolate out a time frame, but not very well because, again, you only have the one option. The Soviets, of course, have their Floggers, their Yak-38s.
But at this time, we know nothing about their capabilities, their design cycle, how long it took, any of that. So functionally, there's just the one aircraft. And with the end of the Cold War, resources drying up, turns out that it took significantly longer, and this whole idea goes away. All these development projects disappear. The idea of putting a flight deck on the battleship disappears. Light carrier concept pretty much disappears. And then next generation vertical takeoff and landing aircraft like the F-35 get super protracted design phases rather than compressing their design phases because you're gaining more experience by making more types of aircraft. It is interesting that ultimately the F-35 fills that Type B role instead of that Type A role that the Navy was looking for. And most of those aircraft being replaced in the Type A role end up getting replaced on time frame anyway, and they're just replaced with derivatives of the Hornet, which at that time was brand new. And then when the Super Hornet comes out, they then say, okay, we'll get rid of the electronics thing and replace it with the Growler and the electronics version, and the Tomcats, the fighter interceptor thing, or the fighter bomber thing of the Corsairs and Crusaders. Those will also be Super Hornets, just Super Hornets across the board. So for me, again, this whole concept was super cool because I'd never heard of the Navy thinking about doing this. Had you ever heard about it before? Let us know in the comment section down below. Do you think it was a good idea? Do you think the Navy should have continued down that path to go to an all vertical takeoff and landing aviation capability? Or do you think they stayed on the right path with going over to the aircraft that we have nowadays? Let us know in the comment section down below. I'm not really an aviation guy, so it's interesting to hear your thoughts on this. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to donate to support the museum. Your support allows us to continue to do research on cool new stuff that I'd never heard about before. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find about the museum and our channel. Thanks for watching.